You know why I love making Sekiro rankings so much? Because there's almost nothing in this game that I dislike. Since this is one of the shortest From Software games, it feels like they were able to put an emphasis on quality over quantity, and I think this strongly applies to the game's areas. Sekiro easily has the smallest area lineup out of the modern FromSoft games, but I also think it has the most consistent quality of the bunch. I've heard some people argue that they seem boring compared to the other game's areas, but I don't know, man, I just strongly disagree. So today I'm gonna rank them from worst to best. The main criteria I'll be going off of is level design, meaning how well the area hides secrets or connects differing pathways. Atmosphere, which refers to the area just having nice aesthetics or a cool vibe, and gameplay, which consists of things like having fun enemies to fight or just any neat gimmicks. I should also mention that if an area has any main boss fights in it, I'm not going to include them, though I am counting mini bosses since they feel more intended to complement an area rather than being their own focused experience. And of course, remember that this is just my opinion. So with all that said, let's begin. Number 8, Abandoned Dungeon. Now, some of you may be thinking,
I have no memory of this place.
And that's because there isn't much to remember. I honestly don't have a lot against this area, but like, this place is just so damn empty. Let's start with the positives though. For one, I definitely think that the lower section is a lot more memorable. Finding my way back to the very beginning of the game's tutorial and realizing that it actually leads to another part of the dungeon was a really cool moment on my first playthrough. Plus, the drop into the bottomless pit to make it to the depths is awesome, and definitely one of the game's best uses of the grappling hook. Also, I know this is a controversial opinion, but I love fighting the Shichiman warrior in here. It's obviously not a very welcoming fight for newcomers to learn, but once you're able to deflect the giant terror balls and beams, I think it's actually a pretty underrated mini-boss. I also like how there's a path behind him that leads back up to the first section of the dungeon. While this place is very tiny and insignificant, for what it's worth, it actually feels pretty well connected. It also has a sort of calming atmosphere to it, since there's barely any real challenges to find within. Plus, Dojin is also a pretty memorable and messed up guy with an intriguing quest. However, that's all I can really think of for this place's positives. The enemies in here generally suck. It's just the annoying ass test subjects along with crickets, geckos, and actually a few Ashina soldiers, which is kinda nice. And that's all I can think of in terms of negatives. Like I said, I really don't have any kind of hatred for this place. It just happens to be my least favorite since, in comparison to all the other complex areas with tons of secrets and stuff to do, there's just not really much to dissect here. I feel like if the devs had a little more time to work on the game, then this may have actually been able to become its own fully fleshed out level, but as it stands, it's just by far the area with the least content. Number 7, Ashina Depths. Aside from the abandoned dungeon, this is the only area in the game that I don't feel particularly positive toward. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call it bad, nowhere near as shitty as some of the worst areas in the other Souls games, but there are just some small things about this place that rub me the wrong way. Let's start with the poison section. It's fine, there's almost nothing to it. It's basically just a fight against a Snake Eyes mini-boss with a bunch of other projectile-wielding enemies surrounding her. Luckily, it is actually set up in a way that you can reasonably take out all of the enemies before fighting the Snake Eyes, so that's nice. Afterward comes the Foggy Forest, which is a pretty cool little experience on your first playthrough. Seeing all the ghostly versions of regular enemies walking about is kind of intriguing the first time around, but anytime after your initial playthrough, it's honestly really underwhelming. The only noteworthy foes here are roosters, monkeys, the headless, and the drunkard fight, all of which you've seen before and don't feel very fitting in this area. I mean, of course, it ends with a fight against Ishin's long-lost relative, Sword Saint Mist Noble, but aside from that, everything up to this point is not very special. Luckily, the last third of the depths is easily the best part in my opinion. While Mibu Village isn't like an S-tier section or anything, there are a few things I like about it. The atmosphere is unlike anything else in the game. Fighting this creepy, run-down village full of mindless, infected villagers that try to swarm you is a pretty unique setting for Sekiro. The story of the village is also pretty well told through the NPCs, and there are a fair amount of cool hidden rooms. Plus, it also has the basket guy. But of course, there's also Orin of the Water. In my opinion, she's easily the best thing about Ashina Depths. Her whole presence and dialogue is so memorably weird, and she's just one of my favorite mini-bosses in the game in terms of moveset. Overall, it's kind of hard to say exactly how I feel about Ashina Depths. On a first playthrough, I'd say that it makes for a cool adventure. The fact that the environment is continuously changing is nice, and I remember having a fun time down here, always being intrigued and wanting to see what would come next. But when you look at it in retrospect, I don't think any of the 3 sections are particularly special on their own. The Poison Swamp is pretty much over in a second. The Foggy Forest is an absolute breeze with very little content once you know how to reach Mist Noble. And while Mibu Village is a decently cool location, it doesn't offer much fun in terms of gameplay aside from Orin, since most of the foes you face are absolute pushovers. But my biggest gripe with the depths just has to be the reused enemies. Obviously, a lot of other areas in this game contain combatants that you see in different places, but it usually always makes perfect sense why the enemies are there. Whereas here, it just feels very haphazardly crammed together. Similarly to the abandoned dungeon, I get the sense that this area was one of the last ones the devs decided to focus on, giving it the short end of the stick in terms of originality. But at the end of the day, it's not like I find it to be overly offensive or annoying to go through, it just pales in comparison to the heights that the other areas reach. Number 6, Sunken Valley. While this area is definitely one of the less memorable parts of the game, I still really enjoy it. I like how it has a more vertical approach to the level design, which goes nicely with the setting of grappling between snowy cliffsides. The first half is mostly centered around fighting the Sunken Valley clan, culminating in the gun fort, which leads to probably my biggest hot take of the video. I really enjoy the gun fort. I've heard a lot of others argue that the sheer amount of enemies with projectile weapons is too damn overwhelming, making this place kind of a nuisance to go through. And while I can see where people are coming from with that argument, I just have to disagree. When you first cross the bridge, it is a little overly hectic, but I've personally found that it's easy to make them lose track of you by just hanging out near the bottom for a sec. And once they've lost their aggro, I think this becomes one of the most well put together stealth sections in the game. Carefully sneaking around this place while avoiding the traps and methodically taking out each of the riflemen is pretty fun in my opinion. While the scattershot dudes can be a pain in the ass to fight in groups, their placements are also set up in a way where if you properly use stealth, you'll never have to fight more than one at a time. Afterward, you get to fight a long-armed centipede, which is a little mindless, but still fun. And then you get ambushed by the second snake encounter of the game. While it's definitely not as memorable as the first snake, I still like it since I really wasn't expecting to see it again on my first playthrough. Plus it's cool how you're able to take it out by utilizing the secret path from Senpo Temple. Then, after making it past the hardest wall in Sekiro, you reach the second half of the area, which takes a drastic turn from the gun-centered direction and becomes a monkey-themed area. The regular monkey enemies aren't anything too special, but I like how there's that one goofy-ass part with a shit ton of them placed in one spot. And of course, there's also the Elder Monkeys, which are without a doubt some of the best and most complex enemies in the entire game. These bearded dudes are so unexpectedly difficult considering that most of the monkeys have barely any HP, whereas these absolute Chad lads can be comfortable counting as full-on mini-bosses, and I have a lot of fun fighting them. Also, for what it's worth, I think that the optional cave down here is a pretty memorable little secret, and being so close to one of the giant snakes is really unnerving, along with the rock diver enemies. The giant Buddha statues in this place are also really cool. So as a whole, I definitely don't think of Sunken Valley as one of the game's highlights, but there also isn't much I dislike about it. Number 5, Ashina Outskirts. I feel like FromSoft is usually pretty damn consistent at making their intro areas. While I don't think Ashina Outskirts stands toe-to-toe with the likes of Central Yarnum or Limgrave, it still does its job really well. The actual level design of this place is a bit straightforward, but I still think there's a lot to appreciate about it. For one, I think it's cool that you can see Ashina Castle in the distance the moment the area's title is dropped. It's like the level's way of letting you know that getting to that place is the ultimate goal of the early game. And once you make it past the Snake Cavern, you can look back and see where you started from, which I find really satisfying. As a tutorial for the grappling hook, Outskirts is an absolute blast to go through the first time around. Learning how to abuse it along with stealth is a lot of fun, and I think the enemy placements here are very consistent. Most of them tend to be weaker foes, but there's also the introduction of some more beefy dudes like the Taro troops and the cannon users. And when you combine these aspects with the introduction of prosthetic tools and the option of using Hanbei the Undying as a literal combat tutorial, I think it turns Ashina Outskirts into a nice training ground that gets you properly acquainted with this game's unique mechanics. And like a lot of other Sekiro areas, its level design can seem kinda basic at a first glance, but when you really start thoroughly exploring, there's a lot more to it than you may initially expect. It has that secret path off to the side which leads to the first headless fight, and it can even take you all the way to the Demon Bell and Senpo Temple if you venture far enough. There's also the well-hidden merchant who you can buy firecrackers from, which will give you a huge advantage. And for what it's worth, I think the dilapidated temple works pretty well as a hub for the early game. It has Hanbei, the introduction of Emma, and it always feels nice to pay a visit to the sculptor.
そこにある優しい顔の仏様、そいつには妙な真似をするなよ。
What do you mean by that?
As far as mini-bosses, this place introduces you to the Ashina Generals, which are some of my personal favorite foes in the game. I think they do a perfect job at teaching you what the game expects in terms of deflecting and punishing. Unfortunately though, the other mini-boss found here is what I consider to easily be the biggest flaw of the Outskirts, as well as one of the biggest flaws of the entire game. Even after beating Sekiro more times than I can count, I still don't like the Chained Ogre, mostly due to the questionable hitboxes of his grab attacks. Like sure, you can eavesdrop on the guys near him to learn that he's weak to fire, but by this point in my first playthrough, I hadn't found the flame barrel yet. So I just ended up spending way longer than I'd like to admit, banging my head against a wall trying to beat him. And I just hate how many stories I've heard of people giving up on the game because of this guy. I think it would genuinely be better off if he was just deleted.
I hate so much about the things that you choose to be.
Luckily, I still think the area ends in a really cool way. Up to this point in the game, things have always been teetering on realism. Like sure, there's the idea of immortality, and a prosthetic arm which also acts as a grappling hook, but you know, most of the enemies you've faced until now have pretty much just been regular dudes. Which is why I love the encounter with the giant snake. It's like a big message from the game letting you know that Sekiro still has some fantasy elements, even if they're not as in-your-face as the other FromSoft games. It's also just really fun and memorable as a little stealth section. But my favorite thing about this area has to be the return to it in the late game. I think it makes for a really enjoyable optional section filled with Redguard soldiers, which I consider to be some of the most fun enemies in the game. So yeah, while Ashina Outskirts definitely isn't one of the more unique areas, I just think it's really solid in terms of gameplay and does a good job at teaching you the game's mechanics. Aside from the ogre. Still hate that guy. Number 4, Hirata Estate. Similarly to the Outskirts, I think Hirata Estate is a damn well put together early game level. My favorite thing about this place is the way it's integrated into the game. Once you get that bell from the crazy old lady in Ashina Outskirts, you're free to visit this area at any time. I think this was a great choice from the developers. Due to Sekiro's unrelenting difficulty on newcomers, there are a lot of spots where people will likely hit a wall on their first playthrough. So the fact that you have the choice of taking a break and trying out this non-mandatory level whenever you get frustrated is great, and helps to make it feel like you've got a variety of options for where to explore in the early game. It's also nice that the atmosphere of this place feels significantly different from everything else in the game. The rainy nighttime setting combined with the present danger of the bandits ransacking the estate makes for a pretty memorable little side adventure, and it feels satisfying to defend the innocent residents by taking out the bandits, even if they're not very openly appreciative about it. This place just has a certain vibe to it that I feel like FromSoft has never really come close to in any of their other games, and I respect it for that. The bandit enemies themselves mostly aren't too special, but I still think they work really well, especially since they have a bit more personality than most other enemies. You can see them trying to break into buildings, chilling by the fire, and there's even that one dude who drunkenly stumbles outside to take a leak. Plus, I think the axe-wielding bandits are actually pretty solid due to their hefty posture and slightly delayed attacks, which can take a bit of trial and error to get used to. Of course, there are also the ones with shields, who do a solid job at introducing you to the axe prosthetic tool. As far as the mini-bosses, Shinobi Hunter Enshin is an absolute pushover on subsequent playthroughs, but on your initial run of the game, I think he's pretty respectable as a tutorial for thrust attacks. And then of course, there's the fight against Juzuo. While the sheer amount of enemies surrounding this guy is a little questionable, I still think it's a fun and memorable fight, especially since you've got this guy on your side to split up their aggro. And once you get Juzuo by himself, it's just awesome. I think the Drunkard moveset is damn well made, and he gets some extra credit for being the first one in the game. However, I definitely think the estate loses some of its luster when you come back to it. Out of all the areas that give you a different experience in the late game, I think Hirata definitely has the most lackluster revisit. It is cool from a story perspective to see what happened after your initial defeat, but you only go through the last part of it, and one of the two mini-bosses is literally just Juzuo again with different enemy placements. But as a whole, I still really like Hirata. I wouldn't say it has some of the most standout level design in the game, but there's a decent amount of secrets to find if you explore. And the fact that it feels so different from everything else in the game helps to make it stand out. Plus, chopping the bamboo is satisfying, and this is where we first witness the game's commonly used gimmick of people talking to you with their last breath before dying. Okay, seriously, I love this game to pieces, but this shit is way overused. Number 3, Senpo Temple. And now we've made it to what I consider the S-tier areas of Sekiro. Senpo Temple is without a doubt in my mind one of the best levels FromSoft has ever concocted. While many of the areas up to this point have been particularly cool in some ways, but lackluster in others, I think Senpo stands strong on every front. It's got a completely unique faction of enemies, some of the most engaging level design in the game, and of course, this place is gorgeous as hell.
After all these years, finally, we have them all.
While I love this area for all of these different reasons, the one thing I can't help gushing about is the visuals. This is an easy second place for me in terms of aesthetics. The amount of beautiful nature scenery with all the different colored trees, along with the somewhat unique architecture found here, makes for some of the best eye candy in the game. While most of Sekiro's areas tend to feel like a grounded and realistic take on Sengoku-era Japan, this is one of 2 locations in the game that fully embrace the mystical fantasy vibe, and it absolutely revels in it. The views near the summit of this place are also just a feast for the eyes. But as I said, visuals aren't the only thing that make this place stand out. The regular monk enemies here are some of my personal favorite out of the game's lowly enemy types. And the ones with bow staffs are just awesome. They have some of the most unique attack patterns in the game, and fighting them is a ton of fun. I also think the ones who throw rockets are pretty decent, definitely one of the best projectile-focused enemy types in the game. Now, I know a lot of people hate on the Spear Adept, and I agree that the placement of 3 of them together at the end of the area is definitely way too punishing and over the top. But when you fight against them solo, I think they're without a doubt some of the best enemies in the game. Their design is really unique, and fighting them feels completely different from any other foe. The way they spin their weapons and dash around at high speeds is so fun to keep up with, especially if you utilize the shuriken. The Armored Warrior is also a super fun and memorable mini-boss who's completely unique to this place. It also helps that in between fighting the enemies, there are a lot of fun sections to explore. I love the way this area utilizes Sekiro's unique traversal mechanics. Making my way to the Demon Bell was pretty memorable the first time around. And it's cool how there's this one spot you can climb which allows you to skip like a whole 1/4 of the area. Also, of course, if you properly use the kite, you can find your way over to the secret path which takes you to the Sunken Valley Passage where you can defeat the giant snake. I've also gotta give props to this place for its environmental storytelling. Right when you enter the area, you're given a warning about the corruption of the monks who live here. And as you continue continue making your way through it, you start to witness evidence of the terrible experiments that have taken place, which makes it feel more satisfying to take out all these screwed up dudes who are willing to throw away lives in their search for immortality. Also, for those of you who have watched my enemy ranking, I'm aware that you can kill the infested seekers with the mortal blade, okay? I think that might be the single most repeated comment on my channel. But anyway, as I've been saying, I think Senpo Temple is a top tier FromSoft area, and without a doubt the highlight of Sekiro's mid-game. Number 2, Ashina Castle. While this area definitely isn't as unique as Senpo Temple, the main reason I have it higher is because I think this place is without question the peak of Sekiro's level design. There are very few areas I can think of in any of the FromSoft games that compete with Ashina Castle in terms of perfectly utilizing the amount of space they have. It's such a dense area that perfectly achieves its goals with basically zero flaws. The moment you first arrive here from Ashina outskirts, you've practically been given access to almost every area in the game, as long as you're willing to explore. If you head straight to the left, then you'll make your way through the abandoned dungeon which leads to Senpo Temple. If you take a slightly different path to the left, then you'll eventually find yourself in the Ashina Reservoir section where the game started. And I think it's really satisfying to find this place and get a sense of where you actually were in the tutorial. Plus, if you head directly to where you spawned, then you'll discover the path into Ashina Depths. If you manage to find any of the various routes that take you behind the castle, then you'll be on your way to Sunken Valley. Furthermore, if you want to actually just beat Ashina Castle itself, then follow the simple rule of keep going up. This will lead you inside the castle where you get to fight some awesome enemies and eventually make it to the very top for your rematch against Genichiro. I just love the way this place is set up. It's basically like the center of Sekiro's world, and I think it does a damn good job at fulfilling that role. There are also plenty of cool secrets to find throughout it, like the hidden room with the prayer bead chest, the shinobi shortcut in Kuro's room that somehow leads all the way back to the dilapidated temple, the rat merchant guy, and the underwater headless, which I think is like a cool little way of rewarding the player for remembering all the water sections in the game after gaining the ability to dive, even if it's not a particularly great mini-boss. But of course, this epic castle is also the absolute best when it comes to the way areas evolve as the game goes on. After completing all of the mid-game levels, you'll be met with a really weird scenario in which all of the castle's checkpoints you've unlocked are now just gone. And as you start to sneak your way back in, you can see why. By this point, all of the small talk you've subtly heard from characters in the early game about the need to prepare for battle has actually come into play. Ashina Castle is no longer just a stagnant location of soldiers guarding their posts. It's become a battlefield full of different enemies of separate factions fighting for it. Then, after making it to the top for the second time, defeating Owl and getting the Divine Dragon's Tears from Fountainhead, it turns into an all-out war zone where the reality sets in that Ashina's reign is coming to an end. Most of the Red Guard soldiers are able to demolish the Ashina combatants with their superior weapons, and with Ishin gone, there's no hope left for Ashina's soldiers. Plus, the fact that there are so many different enemies and unique scenarios leads into my final point of praise, being that this area is such a fun sandbox of foes to fight. There's Ashina fencers, Nightjar, Taro troops, Red Guard soldiers, Interior Ministry ninjas, and Ashina generals, all of which are great enemies in my opinion. On top of that, watching all of these different enemies from different sides fighting each other is a lot of fun. The mini-bosses here are also really solid. It's got generals, lone shadows, Ashina elites, and 7 spears. This place really does have it all, and I can easily see why so many people consider it to be the best area in the game. If I were to try and make an objective ranking of Sekiro's areas, then I might also have it at the top. But personally, there's just one other level that I couldn't give anything other than the top spot. Number 1, Fountainhead Palace. Out of every ranking video I've made on my channel, I don't think there's ever been an easier choice to make for first place. As fantastic as Senpo Temple and Ashina Castle are in their own right, Fountainhead Palace is just my personal favorite area FromSoft has ever made. When it comes to the pure level design, I would definitely say that Ashina Castle is better, but Fountainhead just hits different for me. First of all, it's easily one of, if not my absolute favorite looking place in any video game. Just the way the color scheme comes together with the architecture, the sakura trees, and the water is so damn gorgeous. But even aside from it being basically perfect in terms of visuals, this place just wouldn't be the same without the foes that inhabit it. The Okami warriors are some of my favorite enemies FromSoft has made. While they technically don't have super complex movesets, they're just so exciting to fight. I love how they do a mini version of Genichiro's signature combo, and it's so cool that they can just bounce on you with their sword strikes. Once they start, they'll keep going endlessly until either you break through their posture or mess up and take damage. Plus, you can anti-air death blow them, some of them use lightning reversal attacks, and they're just brimming with personality. I love their little laughs that can come out of nowhere. It feels like they enjoy the hell out of fighting you, which is cool because that goes both ways. Not to mention their battle cries are so epic. Of course, it also helps that the battle music in this area is so peak. It has such a different feel to it than any of the others. It almost seems to treat your duels like an enjoyable dance, rather than a tough burden. When I got to this area on my first run of the game, I genuinely didn't want to leave. I ended up just replaying the second half of it over and over again because the enemies combined with the peak visuals and music was something I couldn't get enough of. Aside from the Okami women, I also kinda like the Palace Hounds since they unexpectedly have the ability to use lightning reversal attacks. And while the Palace Noble's enfeebling ability is a little over the top, I still think they're used in a way that makes the first half of the area a really engaging stealth section, possibly my favorite one in the game. Unfortunately, the mini-bosses aren't much to write home about. As I said before, I like the Shichiman warriors, but I really don't enjoy the Blazing Bulls, even if this one does look kinda cool. The underwater headless are okay, but not that good, and Okami leader Shizu is basically a nothing fight that only exists for level design purposes. Though admittedly, it is a cool purpose. When you first arrive at the palace, if you try to swim, then she'll smite your ass with a lightning strike. But once she's defeated, then you're free to go wherever you want, which allows you to search for useful items in the depths of the water, or progress to the end of the area where you have to stealthily evade the giant carp that can one-shot you. And the final section of this place that builds up to your journey into the Divine Realm to fight the Divine Dragon somehow looks even cooler than the rest of the palace. Also, similarly to Ashina Outskirts, I love that you can see the very end of the area from the beginning, and vice versa. I even love the background music in this place. It's so damn elegant and goes perfectly with taking in all of the beautiful scenery on display. Like I said, I would argue that Ashina Castle probably has the best level design in the game, but I think Fountainhead easily takes the gold medal for both atmosphere and gameplay. Getting to this beautiful palace for the first time, along with fighting Sword Saint Ishin in the game's finale, is one of the main moments that gave me the overwhelming feeling that Sekiro had unquestionably become one of my favorite games of all time. But of course, that's just my opinion. As usual, please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. Also on another note, we're starting to get surprisingly close to the release of Shadow of the Erdtree, and I'm sure many of you are just as hyped as I am. I'm probably gonna make at least one more Elden Ring video before it comes out, partially to get myself in the mood for it. Anyway, that's all I got for now. Until next time.